So hello mga viewers natin, mga ka-UAPGA natin at mga ka-komunidad natin. So first of all, my name is Mark Angelo Vinacion, the communication head of the United Architects of the Philippines Graduate Auxiliary, Quezon City, or the UAPGA Quezon City.
And this is Shaden, and I am also an architecture student in Technological Institute of the Philippines.
So yeah, Shaden, na-excite talaga ako, Shaden, sa mga mangyayari ngayong gabi. Kasi sa day 1 namin, meron kaming event na kung saan our topic is all about the community. Kasi sa UAPGA partner, meron kaming 3 course, which is the advocacy for the community, advocacy for the profession, and also advocacy for the environment. So yun ang topic natin ngayon. So sa first day namin, meron kaming advocacy for the community. Tinakal doon ang lahat ng topic about what is the architecture contribution to the community, to the user itself, partner.
Wow, sobrang alam mo yun, it's really a good topic, partner, kasi knowing nowadays community is really a big part on how we would improve our quality of life. Kaya parang really a good thing na, nandito tayo tapos tinatakal natin tong mga topics na. So it's really a good thing.
Yes, partner. And of course, ngayong araw, ang topic naman natin is environment. So partner, may tanong ako sa iyo before tayo mag-start. Okay. So ang question ko, for you, what is the main contribution of the architecture to the environment?
Okay. Actually, talaga, partner, natutuwa talaga kasi ako sa UAPGA QC. Regardless of the pandemic, knowing na meron silang advocacy towards environment. Kasi sobrang, alam mo yun, knowing na may mga tao pa na nag-iisip ng environment. And those are architecture graduates na, they wanted to improve environment, meaning they also wanted to improve people's life.
Yes, diba? Partner. So, yeah, nakaka-overwhelm talaga, lalo na pag may mga nakaka-appreciate sa amin.
Yes.
Kasi United Architects of the Philippines Graduate Auxiliary, Quezon City, talaga. Pinamumunuan siya ng president, which is si President Aina Buenavista. So, right now, hindi siya makakapunta ngayon. Pero you know what? Siya talaga yung nag-isip kung ano yung magiging atake ng UAPGA Quezon City this year. So, that's why and she also an advocate of environment, partner.
Wow,
yung nakakatuwa
it's
kasi
really a good thing. Yes.
Kasi partner, alam mo yung UAPGA QC, hindi lang yung parang basta-basta kami magkakaroon ng advocacy kasi gusto namin.
Yeah.
Parang meron kasi talaga kami pinanghuhugutan.
Yeah, you should have a goal. Like tulad ni Catriona Gray, 'di ba, partner?
Yes,
parang isa-isang goal tapos meeting the same goal, 'di ba?
Okay.
Yun nga, di ba, napag-usapan na natin yung advocacy ng UAPGA QC. So, sa tingin mo, ano pa yung mga pwedeng improve pa ng UAPGA QC in the near future? Kasi sobrang ganda na nung advocacy. Ano pa kaya yung pwede natin idagdag sa UAPGA QC?
Para sa akin, partner, kasi for example, ang pagtulong kasi sa mga architecture students natin, which is the main goal of the UAPGA, merong UAPGA, is para magkaroon ng helping hands sa mga architecture graduates, kung paano sila magkakaroon ng logbook filing, paano natin sila supportan sa review nila for upcoming architecture licensure exam. But you know what? Kung meron kaming 3 core na ito na iniidagdag, quarter, di ba parang napakabigat?
Yes,
kaagad
exactly.
ng course na to, which is yung advocacy, community, and also in the environment. So para sa akin, part i-improve na lang So kailangan na lang i-improve yung mga advocacies na yun palawakin pa yung pag-aaral namin regarding that advocacy and hanap pa ng maraming members so that we can support this course.
Yes, exactly. So this is one of our major partners. The Climate Reality Project Philippines is the country chapter of the Climate Reality Project, an organization that aims to catalyze a global solution to the climate crisis by making urgent action a necessity across every sector of society. It is founded by former U.S. and Nobel laureate Al Gore and has trained over 21,000 climate reality leaders in 154 countries to help find solutions to the global climate crisis. The Climate Reality Project Philippines is a collaborative, diverse, and multidisciplinary community. Almost 1,200 Pinoy climate reality leaders in innovating to find solutions to the climate crisis through skill sharing, value formation, and capacity building activities, mobilization, and institutionals of nation building efforts towards an inclusive, empowered, and transformed Philippines. Union partner. So please welcome our first speaker as of this is Francis Joseph de la Cruz, Engagement Officer and Climate Reality Leader Global Training of 2020 to present the proposed bill on Department of Disaster Resilience or DDR from the branch.
Yeah, magandang gabi sa lahat ng mga sumusubaybay dito uh, sa webcast ng UAPGA, Quezon City Chapter. I'm here to present, well, mostly my personal views on the Department of Disaster Resilience. Ito kasing bill na ito ay sinimula ng pag-usapan I think there was a version in 2017 or 2018. I think 2017 was the first time it was advanced. No, so this is my personal views based on my experience in dealing with communities who were affected by disasters and communities na nagsimula ring mag-build ng resilience in their own ways. No? And this is spanning a few years. Kasi I'm sure you were very young then. Baka hindi nyo na nabalitaan yung Ondoy. That was 11 years ago. So mga batang-bata pa kayo noon. But the discussions on resilience started even before that, no? 2008, kasi lagi naman tayo sinabi. So anyway, ang pag-usapan natin ngayon is yung House Bill 5989, which is the consolidated version of about 37 House bills proposing a Department of Disaster Resilience. Next slide, please. Hindi pa. Okay, so the DDR bill, sabi ko nga, is consolidated as HB 5989, approved by the Committees on Disaster Response, Government Organization, the Ways and Means Committee, and Appropriations Committee. It's been transmitted to the Senate, and there are 7 Senate bills on the same matter. Ang mangyayari niyan, i-consolidate nila yung dalawang versions, gagawa sila ng isang bicameral report, and if there is agreement, it gets signed by the President or lapses into law. Then it becomes part of the law of the land. Next slide, please. So what are the main elements? They want a new department. No? New in quotation marks kasi parang hindi naman talaga siya bago. Mukhang may mga kukunin lang sila from different departments at pagsasama-samahin. But there will be 1 cabinet level secretary. There will be 4 undersecretaries, 4 assistant secretaries, regional, provincial, and local disaster resilience officers, and 1 resilient office building. So, ano naman ang problema doon? Next slide. It's not the only department being proposed by this administration. Ang priority bills nila, meron pang 2 bills. One is called a bill creating the Department of Overseas Filipinos, bringing together the Office of the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs and the Philippine Overseas Labor Offices and the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration as an attached agency. Mayroon ding House Bill creating a Department of Water, Irrigation, Sewage, and Sanitation Resource Management. In creating bills, I read an article this morning. When this was proposed in 2017, they were thinking of 20 billion pesos to set up a new department. 20 billion pesos. I mean, it's not a small amount of money. If you will remember, and I think you're more familiar with this, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, while the law was passed, I think 2 years ago, creating the department, it was only last year or this year, nung talagang nabuo na yung department. So it takes a lot of resources, money, and time to set up departments in government. Plus, I think there are other important legislative measures na hindi pa natin na-actionan. For example, the National Land Use and Water Act. which I think refers to resilience, refers to water management, etc. Tapos yung isa pa, yung Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. Personally, I think that's even a higher priority. Kasi right now, it's just one small department, the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources under the Department of Agriculture. Sa pangailangan natin sa food security, mukhang kailangan natin i-prioritize ang aquatic and natural and aquatic fisheries and aquatic resources natin. Meron pang mas madali sigurong ipasa yung isang batas that would maybe reiterate, kasi alam ko nasa building code yan, the rain harvesting law, which would require all construction to harvest rainwater. Kasi ang nagiging baha naman is rainwater, no? At least dito sa cities. No? I think these are things na parang ano lang, sa akin, maybe that's not really the priority. Next slide, please. Yeah. So when we talk about resilience, let us remember a few things. No? It's resilience to what? Resilience comes, the discussions on resilience comes usually after a disaster. Ito, hindi akin ito. Merong nagsabi, naririnig ko to from authorities in government. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. There are natural hazards, but disasters are caused by these natural hazards interacting with other factors. For example, bad design. Di ba? If you don't have rainwater harvesting at umuulan, malamang marami kang surface runoff ng rainwater. No? Sabihin, and that can be a disaster. But then at the same time, while we cannot do a lot about the natural hazard, we can do something about the interacting agents. Ang isa pang kailangan tandaan, there are no two disasters that are the same. No? Kahit na flooding yan, the idea of flooding in some places are really bad news. For example, in Marikina. But in places where they rely on flooding so that you get topsoil to cultivate your plots, that is not a problem for them. I mean, ang problema nga sa kanila, pagka hindi nag-flood kasi that means it would affect their harvest no, sa panahon ng drought. So, and then this formula, if there's one thing you should remember, ito yon. Risk is equal to hazard times exposure times vulnerability and adaptive capacity. I think it's very important for architects, architecture students, and architecture graduates to think about this. No? Kasi when you design a community, when you design a building, you have to look at the risk. Di ba? May flooding, meron bang hazard dyan ng flooding? May hazard ba ng fault line? May hazard ba ng at kung ano-ano pa. No? And I think this is something that we have to start using regularly in whatever planning we'll have in our communities. So ito yung disasters. Next slide, please. So ano naman pala yung resilience? Kung minsan ang sabi, don't glorify resilience. No? Kasi ang Pilipino naturally resilient. Para daw tayong ano eh. Pero ano nga ba to? Pagtitiis nga lang ba ito? Is it just grit? Is it just our survival instinct? Is it our capacity to bear suffering? Kasi kung yun lang, mataas ang grade ng mga Pilipino dyan. Kasi sobrang matiisin tayo, sobrang mapagpatawad, sobra-sobra doon. But it's not resilience. No? Resilience is also the ability to bounce back. And it's also increasing your capacity to recover quickly kung tamaan ka ulit ng disaster. Pero kung ulit-ulit, sabihin nangyari na yung Ondoy at nangyari ulit yung Ulysses, no? I don't think surviving those would be considered resilience kasi hindi tayo nag-bounce back better, or we were not in a better position in 2020 calling the lessons from 2009. So ito yung isang i-offer ko na ino-offer na definition ng resilience. And I will not read through it because I don't have a lot of time. But yun na lang keywords. If you're able to anticipate, resist, absorb, accommodate, cope, adapt to, recover, and transform from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, then you can say you are resilient. Next slide, please. Now, will creating a new department lead us to a more resilient society? Mukhang obvious naman. In my view, hindi. No? Ngayon, yung mga susunod na slides, ipapakita kung bakit. Kasi I've seen resilience, I've looked it in the eye when I work with communities who suffered suffered disasters and bounced back. Next slide, please. So, ito yung kailangan natin. Better governance and engaged citizenry. We have to improve our disaster risk reduction and management, preparedness, avoidance, mitigation, and transfer. We have to support our state agencies in science and technology that are responsible for projection on natural phenomena. I think we should give PAG-ASA, more respect. No? Kasi, ano naman sila eh. I mean, I think you put them side by side with, more better funded agencies, lumalaban ang PAG-ASA. And this is something that I'm saying this because somebody told me his view of PAG-ASA. And this is an Australian meteorologist. No? Believe siya. Kasi dito daw, kahit ang pansukat natin, yung mga basyong bote lang ng soft drinks. And I'm sure we have upgraded that. No? Pero nakikita niya how good people are, even with very little resources. We also need to mobilize people like you, architects, designers, environmental planners, the academic and professional community to provide research support to local government units in planning, especially in high-risk areas. I know many architects are moving into environmental planning. I hope we'll have more of you dito sa usapan on resilience. Ito yung sinasabi kong pictures ng resilience na nakita ko. And this is just a few more slides. Next slide, please. So etong lugar na ito ay sa Eastern Samar. Eastern Samar, sila yung nag-welcome kay Yolanda. How resilient are they? I mean, people, natakot ba sila? Of course, natakot sila. But they know what to do. Yung unang picture na nakikita nyo, nasa bandang kalawa, yung parang mga bundok, yan ay papunta sa isang kuweba. Diyan nagtatago yung mga tao pag may parating na bagyo. And they're not doing this, they didn't do this only in 2013. They've been doing this ever since. Ang dinagdag lang namin, para hindi sila gumamit ng sulo kasi masisira yung kuweba, naglagay tayo ng renewable energy. At we made it portable so that people, when they have to move to the caves, ang dala-dala nila ay yung portable na solar pack. So hindi masisira yung kuweba pag gumagamit sila ng kerosene lamps habang nasa loob sila. Tapos ganun din sa kanilang water sanitation hygiene facilities nung nakapagtayo na sila. Kasi kung minsan may nagtatayo ng wash facilities, nalilimutan yung ilaw. So hindi rin ginagamit kasi madilim. Next slide please. Last two slides daw. Ito naman ay sa Suluan. Suluan is a community, it's a barangay. Bago pa tinamaan ng Giwan, sila na muna ang tinamaan. And they have the same story. The picture on the right with people holding lights, yan din ay nasa loob ng kuweba kung saan sila nagtatago. I'm not saying kailangan magtago tayo lahat sa kuweba. Ang gusto ko lang ipakita rito, because that is what they have. Kuweba ang meron sila. Yan yung ginagamit nila in preparation for disasters. And I would just love to be able to bring more resources, yung sinasabi kong resources, to these people, because I think these are the people who can teach us about resilience, because they're bouncing back. Pagkatapos itong pailaw na to, nagtatanong na sila ng solar refrigerator kasi fishing ang kanilang hanap buhay, because they also dream of being able to sell their products in the market at better prices. Last slide. And then we do some trainings. So it would be ito yung ginagawa namin. Pagka panahon ng wala na sa disaster, in preparation, if people want to have their own tech packs, we give training. So sa akin, yung last 3 slides, that is how I knew and I learned what resilience is from people who were practicing it. They're preparing, they're forecasting, they are avoiding, they're mitigating, and they are bouncing back. So I think that's a lesson that I'd like us to take to heart. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, well, yun lang. These are just reminders. Think of the risk society. Ito, pag-aaralan ko pa to, yung risk society. How we can be more attuned to our the challenges of development and the challenges of humanitarian action by folding in yung risk society na sinasabi sa ating plan. So, yun lang. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Mr. Francis Joseph de la Cruz, for that wonderful, grabe, sobrang gandang insights ng mga sinabi ni
Yeah, of
Sir
course, partner.
Francis.
And
Actually, nung nakikinig ako, I was actually taking notes of all the, yung mga sinabi ni Sir Joseph dito regarding, risk society. So, hindi pala talaga dapat, yung parang yung magbabounce back ka lang. Dapat may advantage. Kailangan merong may improvement. Hindi pwede na nag-bounce back ka lang without knowing ano yung next step.
yes, partner.
Ganon.
And of course,
ganon.
partner, ako din natuwa din ako na yung mga kababayan natin sa Leyte ba yun? Na
Samar, yes.
Samar at Leyte. Yung ginagamit nilang resources, ginagamit nila lahat ng resources nila, like nagtatago sila sa kuweba pag may darating na bagyo. Kasi yun lang yung meron sila. At 'di ba, parang sila talaga yung mga tunay na resilient eh. Sila talaga yung mga tunay na kaya magtiis, partner.
Yes. Kasi siguro there's actually two words na I actually want take note of Sir Francis talk regarding risk society. Sabi niya doon, recover and transform. So basically dapat pala yung isang community hindi lang siya nagre-recover sa isang, kunyari kasi nga sabi niya yung natural there's no such thing as natural disaster kasi natural hazards is actually caused by yung mga factors na yung mga external factors that makes the natural disaster itself. So si natural hazards nandiyan na yan, pero yung mga factors na katulad ngayon, so kung hindi natin naalagaan yung environment, so main point is that we need to, mitigate. You have to make sure na meron tayong magagawang step para maalagaan si Mother Earth.
Okay, so yeah. So marami tayong natutunan ngayon.
Yes,
So ating mga
sobra.
viewers, kung may mga comments kayo at may mga gusto ko yung sabihin, just comment down below, okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Grabe, sobrang naging malaking impact din yung una nating naging discussion with Sir Francis. Now, ngayon,
We're gonna start the part 1, the primer. So I'm gonna explain first what is the primer is. So we have 30 to 40 minutes of it. So each panelist will have a 10 to 15 minute presentation regarding the topic that is expected to set the mood for the panel discussion. It could consist of related projects like personal or other projects, thoughts, and ideas that are related to the topic.
Okay,
So right there.
got it.
So yeah. So first of all, we have our speakers. So papakilala muna natin sila,
Mga
partner.
speakers, yes.
Okay. So our first speaker is architect Louis Gunn from L.A. Gunn Associate. Louis Gunn is the first Filipino architect and urban planner professionally accredited by international organization in green building and urban planning. He is also a UN consultant and currently undergoing biomimicry training.
Alright.
So please welcome architect Louis Gunn.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. First, salamat sa UAPGA for inviting me as one of your guest speaker for this webinar topic, the Green Architecture Advocacy. So, just to share with you my insights about green architecture, the first time I heard about green architecture is during my college years. In fact, I read books, references about blue architecture. This pertains to architecture in underwater or water landscape. And of course, I read a lot about green architecture, which focuses on resource efficiency and environmental stewardship. And because of this curiosity, it inspired me to go deeper and understand what makes a building truly green. And I believe we are all gathered here in this webinar to explore what truly is the definition of green architecture. And if we want to understand green architecture, we need to know, of course, the different elements of a building. And these elements, this includes site, energy, water. We also have the building materials, the transportation, indoor environment quality, and other social and environmental elements of the site. And um, and of course, let me start by discussing further some of the concerns in site. And I think this is fundamental because we are talking about site. There are many elements inside that we need to incorporate in our design to make our buildings more sustainable. So for site, of course, we have stormwater flooding. Itong taong to, we have Ulysses. Nakita natin kung ano talaga yung problema na meron sa Metro Manila, for example. And we can assume that this is happening, yes, because of climate change, global warming, tumataas yung rate ng flooding at ulan. But I think one of the ways for us to make our buildings more resilient to these environmental forces is to incorporate strategies. Let's say, for example, perhaps we can use pervious paving or pavement instead of impervious building materials. Ang nangyayari kasi, our stormwater infrastructure are very centralized. Okay? Sinasabi kong centralized, ibig sabihin nito, yung bawat development, yung bawat lote, bawat building, instead of individually, they provide some form of stormwater retention in their site. Eh, ang nangyayari, tinatransfer lang natin papalabas sa public infrastructure. So perhaps there is a need for us to change our principle in designing. In fact, sa building code nga natin, we have ISA, we have USA. Pag sinabi ng IS, alam natin ito. We have impervious surface area, we have unpaved surface area. The purpose of this standards in our code is to at least minimize our reliance for stormwater retention instead of transferring our stormwater sa public. Dapat yung bawat site natin meron contribution on how to minimize itong stormwater. Okay? So this is the reason why in nature, for example, if you go to, of course, alam natin sa forest, Sierra Madre, they are very fundamental to make our built environment more resilient to flooding kasi unang-una, natural environment, of course, they absorb stormwater. Okay? So perhaps if we are the designer, we can learn something from forests and integrate the same principle from a forest and use it in our building design. And another concern here in Metro Manila, although hindi ito masyado na pag-uusapan, pero nangyayari ito every summer, is urban heat island. Yung urban heat island, ito yung pag-init ng syudad kumpara doon sa sa surrounding niya. Obviously, it's because of the building materials we are using. And of course, hindi ito masyado napapansin, pero every summer maraming namamatay na tao, especially people with high blood pressure and elderly. These are the people that are more vulnerable to heat island. No, hindi ito masyado na news every summer, but definitely if you try to look for the statistics, marami pong namamatay na elderly and high blood pressure na mga tao during summer. Okay? Perhaps in our materials, we need to incorporate some, we use materials that has high heat absorptive. Alam natin in Metro Manila, in urban areas, mostly we use concrete, no, sa mga pader. Is because we have the building code, so kailangan yung it has something to do with fire risk. So we have to use concrete. And concrete is one of the high heat absorbers material which contribute to urban heat island. Perhaps we can explore some strategies in terms of its color. No? In the physics, alam natin, white is the most reflective color. Therefore, we may be able to use white color. Okay. In fact, in nature, if you know desert snail, in desert snail, they thrive in a very hot environment. Okay, napakainit. Pero yung shell nila is color white. So for millions of years, these species, they've been using this strategy. And recently lang, na-discover natin that white is the most reflective color. But perhaps we can use nature as our inspiration in order to provide strategy for this, for some of these environmental forces that we are facing here in Metro Manila. And of course, if you want to reduce urban heat island, we can explore urban design elements such as street orientation, so that our community, they can leverage natural ventilation from prevailing wind. No, nangyayari kasi natatrap yung init sa sa urban canyons. So nangyayari, hindi siya na-flash out. That's why it contributes to urban heat island. So ito lamang yung mga concerns sa site na maganda, aware tayo. Kasi nga, individually, each of our buildings, they contribute to stormwater and urban heat island. And papunta naman tayo sa energy component ng building. And of course, when we talk about energy consumption, this has something to do with carbon emission. Of course, the more power is consumed in a building, the more carbon emission is. Of course, literally, wala tayong makita sa building na nag-i-emit ng pollution. But if you go to power plant, they emit a lot of pollution. This has something to do, of course, with climate change and global warming. And of course, if you want to leverage, if you want to improve our energy consumption, there is a need for us to leverage free energy by way of orienting our buildings with respect to prevailing wind or sunpath. Of course, isa sa mga free resources na pwede nating makuha is natural lighting. So natural lighting, of course, if you use natural lighting, we may reduce our reliance on artificial lights. We can do this by way of providing minimum window to wall ratio, no? Pero yun nga, we have to take into account yung glare. Ang nangyayari kasi minsan, we allow too much natural light. Yes, it reduces energy, but there is a comfort issue that we need to consider as well, yung glare. Masyadong masakit siya sa mata. At sa building facades naman, mahalaga, if your building is facing south or southwest, we need to use solar shading. Probably that's the cheapest strategy in order to avoid direct solar exposure coming inside the building. And there are other strategies that we can use. We have double glazing, low emissivity, low E-glass ang tawag nila. Yun nga lang, medyo mas mahal siya, but definitely these are just some of the technologies that we can use in order to lower our energy consumption for building. Of course, natural ventilation, if we allow it in our building, it can we can reduce our cooling load requirements, and of course, less power consumption. Yun nga lang, in urban area, medyo challenging yung natural ventilation kasi unang-una, yung air pollution, ayaw natin na mapunta yung yung pollution papunta sa building natin. And of course, if you refer to nature, there are many structures in nature that leverages this natural ventilation, yung termite mound, ant nest. Ito yung mga ito yung mga natural or organisms that we considered as the best mechanical engineers in nature because they mastered ventilation. Perhaps we can use these organisms in order for us to make our building more energy efficient. Of course, marami pang iba, no? We have renewable and clean energy, solar panel, photovoltaic, geothermal, wind turbine, so forth. So these are all can help lower energy consumption in buildings. Pagdating naman sa water, of course, we need to harness free water resources as much as possible. We can capture rainwater. Alam natin we can capture rainwater by way of harvesting it, and we can use it for non-potable uses such as watering of plants, cleaning non-food items or tools. We can also use it for flushing of toilets and urinal, etc. Marami tayong pwede mapagamitan, no? if we only harvest rainwater. And of course, once we use potable water or rainwater, we can still recycle it. No, for example, we can recycle it integrating other systems, filtering systems para pwede natin siyang i-recycle pa ulit-ulit. Or we can also use recycled water coming from cooling towers or ACUs. Pwedeng i-recycle to, pwede rin magamit ito. And of course, there are many technologies that we can integrate in our building that further enhances water efficiency. Low flush toilet, water flow restrictor. Makakatulong din kung meron tayong water metering in every in every toilet siguro para ma-identify natin kung saan yung may leak. Therefore, mape-prevent natin yung wastage. And of course, one of the important factors for water efficiency is I think we also need to recharge our water aquifer. In Metro Manila, according to studies, Metro Manila, there nagsisink siya dahan-dahan, no? Half inch a year. If I remember it correctly, ganun yung bumababa yung Metro Manila. It's because we are consuming a lot of water, pero we are consuming a lot of groundwater, okay? Pero hindi tayo tumutulong doon sa aquifer recharge. So that's one of the challenge na I think we can let our design contribute to this aquifer recharge. Of course, another components in green architecture is materials. As much as possible, we use readily available materials. When we say readily available materials, pwede gamitin natin regional or indigenous materials, anything that is near our site. Siguro dapat yun yung gamitin natin instead of using materials coming from different countries. Kasi kapag gumawa tayo ng materials coming from different countries, we are increasing the carbon footprint of our buildings, no? In transportation, in gas, etc. These all can contribute to carbon emission. Perhaps we can also, some of the strategies that we can do is to reuse materials from demolished buildings, no? So as much as possible, if we use materials from demolished building, we avoid extraction of new raw materials. And of course, other components of building materials, we need to avoid toxic materials. Instead, we use materials with small subset of elements, perhaps copper, aluminum, tin, so forth. These are all materials that if you leave it in the environment, they don't create, and they are not toxic, no? There are building materials kasi na dahil kino-combine yung iba't ibang chemical and create a new building material. Ang problema, if you throw it in the environment, it creates adverse effect, no? Nagiging toxic siya. And of course, we have to avoid the use of plastic as much as possible, no? Kasi they don't degrade unless we have a strategy of recycling them back. And there are also renewable materials that we can use. We have bamboo. Perhaps we can use tree or wood that are sustainably harvested, okay? Or we can also include material recycling such as storage and collection of recyclable materials in our buildings. Sa batas natin, meron tayong material recovery facility, but perhaps in each of our building design, we have this element of material recovery facility para ma-provide natin yung mga users, no, to have an attitude wherein they recycle all the materials in that building. Okay, and another concept that is happening right now, we have urban mining. Kung sinabi din, ang nangyayari kasi we are mining the natural environment, pero our built environment can also be used for mining. Ang tawag dito urban mining. Perhaps yung mga nade-demolish na building, yung mga old building, these can all function or as a resource for raw materials for new construction. And another component for green architecture is transportation. So when we talk about transportation, alam natin in our building code, we are required to provide minimum number of parking bago siya ma-approve. So I think we need to change this standard. Instead of providing minimum parking for cars, siguro napapanahon na para mag-provide tayo ng minimum parking for bicycle facilities. Okay? Lalong-lalo na ngayon. We experience pandemic, ang daming walang sasakyan, napilitan maglakad. So, nagkaroon ng debate. Buti pa yung mga mayayaman, they can move around because they have cars. So, this is something that we need to consider in our design. And of course, we need to create a community architecture that encourage walking or create an ambience of a walkable community. Okay? Kasi ngayon, if you observe our housing design, we always highlight the importance of carports in our facade. Okay? So I'm not saying that we remove them, but I think the most important component that we have to include in our design is to create a facade that enhances or promote walkability if you move around that community. Kasi ano nangyari nga, if you go to residential subdivision, makikita mo, these are all, meron silang infrastructure for gates para sa sasakyan. So perhaps we need to change some of our design practices, in order to change how people think about transportation, especially for walking. Of course, another component is we need to incorporate indoor environment quality. So according to studies, tayo, especially urban people, 90% of our time in a day is spent indoors. Okay, 90%. So there is a necessity to incorporate strategies in indoor environment to create a more safe and healthy for users. So hindi lang tayo concerned sa pollution sa labas. Of course, sa loob ng building natin, sa indoor environment, there are also factors for pollution. So in this case, perhaps we can use materials that are low emitting or non-toxic materials. Alam natin, we use paints, we have adhesives. So we need to make sure that the paints that we are using or the adhesive that we're going to use are free from chemicals such as urea, formaldehyde, kasi cancerous siya. Okay? And of course, in indoor environment, mahalaga din na ma-provide natin yung lighting because it dictates mood and behavior. Warm light, cool light, as much as possible, we have to simulate the setting of the natural sunrise and sunset so that our body could also adapt to those changes para maganda yung sleeping pattern. And of course, we need to avoid too much humidity indoors kasi mas maraming humidity, nagkakaroon ng mold. In the Philippines, medyo hindi tayo aware about mold, pero yun nga, this is one of the considerations that we need to know in indoor environment kasi sa mga asthmatic, delikado to. Okay, so again, there are many factors in indoor environment that we need to consider. No? Yung noise, we should be quality of view, pest management, daylighting, so forth, ventilation, air filtration. These are all strategies that we can incorporate in our indoor environment. And yeah, so perhaps we need to assess our direction where we are headed in terms of design. So is it possible that our building can function like a tree, and collectively these buildings that functioning like a tree can function like a forest collectively? Okay, perhaps we need to share our built environment as well with other species such as birds, pollinating insects, and other animals that can help us thrive even further. So ngayon kasi we are creating a lot of green architecture design, but we are missing some elements of integrating habitable space for species. I think we need to consider this in our design if we really want to go sustainable. Okay, perhaps there is a need to revisit ancient knowledge, especially in design and construction. So alam natin dito sa Pilipinas, marami tayong ancient or let's just say mga struktura ng ating mga katutubo. Marami tayong matututunan sa kanila because their practices in design and construction, they use indigenous materials. Ibig sabihin nito, they only use locally available materials. Kung ano yung meron sa site, sa area nila, ito na mismo yung ginagamit nila. And of course, their buildings, for example, bahay kubo, wala lang sa slides, they leverage free energy, wind, sun, water, food. Minsan, doon na rin mismo yung, yung alaga nila. So, these are some of the ideas that I think we can incorporate in our design to make our urban buildings more sustainable. And I think one of the most important factor that we can learn from these ancient knowledges is the culturally responsive design, because they have a sense of identity. No? Bahay Kubo, bahay sa Ifugao, etc. and other indigenous structures, meron silang identity which is not embedded in our urban design structures. Okay? So hindi mo ma-identify kung Filipino ba to or kung ano, no? It's because of globalization. Okay? So I think, yeah. So before I end my presentation, I think we need to be humble in our design instead of aiming for a design that is different because we want to be famous or whatever. Perhaps we can learn from nature and not rely on existing human knowledge and technologies, so that we can create a more sustainable world, not only for human or for our next generation, but also for other life on this planet. So yun lamang po, maraming salamat.
So, yeah, thank you so
Thank you
much,
so much.
Architect Luwigan. So, your partner, napaka-inspiring talaga yung message ni Sir. Lalo na, nag-notes kasi ako, partner. So, especially about the energy consumption, the urban heat island. So, diniscuss niya kung ano ba yung mga pwede natin gawin, like choosing the right materials, and also the color is important.
Yes.
Also the orientation and natural ventilation, partner.
So it really affects, no? Talagang ang daming pwedeng factors yung sa green architecture in order for you to have, sustainable buildings.
At saka, partner, gusto ko na yung sinabi niya yung about transportation, lalo na ngayon, partner, na marami na yung gusto maglakad. So we need to provide a walkable community and bicycle facilities or bicycle parking areas, di ba, partner? So sobrang marami na nagbabike ngayon, partner. At least, di ba, ngayon nakikita kung gaano ka-importante yung mga bicycle lane, mga walkways, di ba, partner?
So parang ano nga yung means ni architect regarding the concern. Yung alam mo yung, syempre, it's not about only the, improving your health, kasi syempre nag-walk and everything, but it's actually improving the quality of the community na imbes na madaming carbon emission with the cars, nalalesen natin by, having those bicycle lanes and, walkable, areas.
And also, partner, gusto ko rin yung sinabi ni Sir na about we need to avoid toxic materials and we need to have a material recovery facility. So, para ma-recycle natin yung mga materials na nagagamit noon. Like, sinabi niya sa akin yung urban mining, yung parang nagkakaroon ng pagsira sa mga dating buildings, sa urban. So, yung mga materials doon, pwedeng dalhin sa material recovery facility. So, para magamit ulit, partner, di ba? So, yeah. So, right now, we're gonna proceed to our next speaker.
Let's go.
Okay. Our next speaker is architect Ronnie Humang Design Studio. Ronnie Humang is an ASEAN architect and environmental planner. He is a graduate of Bachelor of Science in Architecture from Polytechnic University of the Philippines. He is the president or CEO of Humang Design Construction and Development Incorporated and Joya Properties Incorporated. Again, please welcome architect Ronnie Humang of Humang Design Studio.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Maki. No worries about that. And thank you very much for inviting me here. And I will be presenting regenerative architecture systems thinking, which is quite a new word for every. I think each one of you just heard about it, or maybe some of you heard what regenerative architecture systems thinking is. No, but this is totally different from the green and sustainable model that we are discussing right now. Because when I attended a lot of seminar and trainings about green thinking, the green model, I realized that there is a gap. I don't know how huge or what the gap is in between the situation of about the green sustainable model. But I think that this is a very significant situation that we need to address. That's the reason why um, I dwell into regenerative architecture systems thinking. In a few moments, you will be able to understand what I meant about what I meant of regenerative architecture. I will be discussing what is regenerative architecture and the oikos, or our new norm. No? The oikos is uh, a play of word about ecology. No? And lastly, I will be discussing about the living systems design, or nature's design. The objective number one is to do understand our construction resources are limited. First and foremost, hindi ito one to sawa yung material na ginagamit natin. So whenever you design concrete, glass, steel, hindi yan unlimited, no? Hindi yan kagaya ng ginagamit ninyong load na unli, no? Ito, there is these are finite resources, okay? Next is make architecture and the built environment contribute to ecosystems health. Okay? Hindi po pwedeng maganda lang yung ating architecture. Hindi po pwedeng iconic lamang siya. No? This is one thing that I realized during the pandemic situation. I'll be explaining that to you later on. And lastly, the objective is to create designs that are eco-centric, frugal, and regenerative living, not focused on human-centric. For several centuries, we focused our design, our architecture, into humans. We believe that humans are the most important species on Earth, but truth of the matter is we are not the most important species on Earth. Okay, so further to discuss my topic, for many centuries, man evolved a civilization centered to his needs, comfort, and safety, which we called human-centric or anthropocentric. We created buildings, cities, metropolis, predominantly concrete. Okay, this is where the problem lies. Our world population will balloon to 9 billion by 2050. We will continue to build infrastructures, communities to serve the steeping population. We will use the same saved resources up until then. This is the very purpose of green and sustainable model. No? We want to reduce, we want to become more efficient on our usage of these resources, the water, the electricity, the materials. No? We want to save. We want to become efficient. That's the reason why we develop a more sophisticated technology to be able to measure a more efficient usage of this material. Am I correct? Now, what if I tell you that we are running out of sand? This may be an overstatement. We have so many natural resources, as we all know. No? We will not run out of these aggregates. Or think of it as an understatement. These are finite resources. It will take 200 million years to produce new sand. 50 billion tons are being extracted annually, enough to cover California 2 inches deep and the Philippines 5 inches deep. This is a staggering amount. Most consumed natural resources besides water and air, even more than oil. In fact, in India, it is a crime, no? Nagpapatayan sila just to sell sand. Where are we going to get resources to build for the ballooning population? When material becomes scarce, the price will go up. Either we wait for it to happen, or we develop our strategic foresight thinking that will address the new epoch of Anthropocene. We extract aggregates from the mountains. We dredge sand from the ocean floor. This causes disruption of the so-called Emelenia hoxleyi, or an important component of coccolithophore. Coccolithophore grows on the seabed and produces clouds, which in turn produces rain that's scattered on terrestrial bodies. When these cycles are disrupted, we experience severe weather problems. And that is why we are all here right now. When you dredge sand on the seabed, on the seafloor, akala natin walang mangyayaring masama, no? And that is where the problem lies. Hindi natin alam, it reduces the production or um, the the multiplicity of the coccolithophore that I'm talking about earlier. Now, with this, every materials on the buildings that we use affects the smallest and the biggest, the prettiest and the ugliest species on Earth, which is vital to the equilibrium of the Earth. No, we continue to be egocentric or shift to ecocentrism, thinking that all lives matter. Now, this is the problem that I'm talking about earlier. We develop a thinking that humans are important because of our thinking that man is supreme. No, man is the most important species on Earth. Pero sa isang kagat lang ng lamok, pwedeng mamatay ang tao. No, dengue, for example. And right now, because of this pandemic, the COVID-19, it can wipe out the whole humanity. No? So that is only because let us set aside the argument for a moment that the pandemic, the COVID-19, is caused by zoonotic disease. Okay, this is to establish the issue that we are already um, um, taking too much space or taking too much abuse of the natural resources. Neglect and ignorance, deliberate or not, is causal to irreversible environmental damage, leading to our sixth major mass extinction on Earth, caused by a single species, yet have an awareness of doing so. This is what you call man. In so doing, we should transcend to regenerative lifestyle. It is a systems thinking that built environment is in co-creative collaboration with other biota of the natural systems. It is engaging the built environment into the complex ecology of the site. Is that it does not displace other living communities, but treat them as an equal shareholder in the site, where the built environment becomes an important abiotic element and contributor, weaving on the positive health of the site's ecosystem. This is what I'm talking about earlier. Iconic buildings or landmark buildings, which humanity prides themselves to build such beautiful structures, but it ends there. Being beautiful, being the most important building for humanity, but it doesn't contribute to the health of the ecosystem. Now, if we continue to do this, it can wipe out the whole of humanity because of our destruction to nature. No, come to think of it, you are trying to take out mountains of aggregates or seas of seabeds of sand. No, you are taking away or you are shooing away the habitat of living organisms. All right. Now, we should embrace ecological wisdom and indigenous wisdom. I would like to share with you a story. No? Batanes survived Super Typhoon Ferdy in 2016 with a very stark comparison with Super Typhoon Yolanda, which registered more than 6,000 deaths plus almost 2,000 casualties despite happening similar extreme weather in 1890. I would like to repeat that. No? Hindi ito ngayon lang nangyari kay Yolanda. Nangyari na ito on 1890. No? Nangyari yan at patuloy na nangyayari because of the cyclic extreme typhoon. No? Every 100 years to 150 years, nangyayari yan. Now, because of climate change, lumalapit yung kanyang cycle. 50 years, 25 years. In fact, habagat nga lang no? Kahit na habagat lang, bumabaha sa atin at ang daming nasasalanta. No? Now, this was also happened, no? The devastation because it is situated, Samar, Leyte, Tacloban, no? Is situated on a typhoon belt. And these are, of course, included on the CLUP of every municipality or city. No? Alam nila na nangyayari yan. But they're not doing anything to be able to stop or prevent or at least to cushion the situation. Let me tell you the story of indigenous Ivatan by the name of Cesar S. Ducul, a regional disaster risk officer of Batanes local government. Few days before Batanes was hit by one of the most intense tropical cyclones on record, which is the Typhoon Ferdy, he noticed an unusual natural phenomenon on his surroundings. The endemic Arius, or ito yung tinatawag na Podocarpus costalis, with the budding yellow-green leaves, are unbelievably growing very, very fast. Second, the curled banana leaves are suddenly drooping towards earth. He also witnessed a very rare occurrence of an unusually bamboo shoots grow fast, equal in height, which is a very rare occurrence on his lifetime. It turned out to be a nature's warning of a very strong typhoon coming. Batanes was raked by a Category 5 Super Typhoon Ferdy with international name Meranti on the 12th of September 2016. Batanes battered with 315 kilometers per hour with 10 minutes sustained wind. Reported 0 deaths, 0 casualties, and few damages compared to several billions of damages caused by Yolanda. The world are focused its attention, technology, and monetary resources to Yolanda, but nobody knows similarly happened in Batanes. I never heard them scream for help or donations. This is the true wisdom of resiliency. I emphasize, this is the true wisdom of resiliency. Moving forward, by creating or by doing the creative frugal innovation, we believe that having more and bigger is better. The pandemic gave us a realization, what does these beautiful buildings can do beyond its iconicity? What if we make it a good contributor, sensible to Earth's health? It is impossible not to make a building beautiful if it is sensible. People crave for new solutions on the post-crisis gloom with a more balanced lifestyle to help create a new economic system, a frugal economy. By living less, in India, they call it jugad. It is removing elitism on innovation. They developed a primitive techniques and made electricity less, refrigerator that can store food for 3 to 5 days. Another one is the earth cooker that utilizes wood from your backyard, and the solar bottle which the former actor Ilyak Diaz popularized on his Liter of Light project, which is very relevant, especially on rural areas. Jugad methodology becomes the focus of well-known universities worldwide. Some created a program while multinational companies benefit from a large revenue brought by it. No? Indians, they even sent their mission to Mars called Mangalyan for a measly 20% or 80% less of NASA's cost. Creative frugal, or what more, it's even more less than what Elon Musk is doing right now. No, creative frugal innovation is more than a strategy. It denotes a new frame of mind, one that sees resource constraints as an opportunity, not a liability, and spreads the opportunity of growth from the grassroots to the middle component of the social pyramid, dispersing the global wealth not to a few billionaires or trillionaires, but to other species of Earth. Empowering bottom to top methodology will mitigate the probable improbable. This is what the situation that was explained also by Nicholas Taleb on his book, The Black Swan. No? If we will only let a few people to get rich, trillionaires and billionaires, no, um, we will going to have a social problem because the structure creates only a few wealthy people. But if we will create more prosumers, prosumers are the so-called, you involve the consumer to produce also the product, and so they become the producer and the consumer themselves. So you lower the cost, and you created a much more significant or much more sensible product. Okay, let us use concrete where it's only necessary. I'm not saying that we will not use concrete anymore. What I'm trying to say is we reduce the use of concrete. We only use it where it is necessary. No, in fact, we have a huge deficit on aggregate and cement. No, because of our build project. Even though we import cement, sand, or gravel, no, you are still destructing the environment of other countries like Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia, for example. No? We will still be affected because we are all interconnected. It is almost 65% of construction supplies, no, the residential sector, no, these are comprised of 65% of the construction supplies. No, it will be a relief on habitat loss if these 65% will use less of concrete. Another material we use, actually, I use these kinds of material. No, I use rammed earth, compressed earth blocks, and pavements, and we employ primitive techniques of mixing mud, loam, sieved gravels, and a little of cement without steel bars. Actually, it resulted into an adobe blocks that created by nature, this time enhanced by man. We are building a regenerative community in Alfonso, Cavite, here in our place right now. 60% habitable space and 40% biodiverse ecotone, a life assemblage where we will practice what we preach. This is where we will get and share our food, wood, play with dragonflies and kingfisher during day, and enjoy the fireflies at night. We restore, conserve, and replenish what we will consume. We hope to influence others and follow our regenerative lifestyle. It is at this point where the greatest lesson unfolds. Man needs nature. Nature does not need man. Earth has been existent for over 4.5 billions of years. Man has been staying for 3.8 seconds of 24 hours planetary existence. Man is only 0.01% of the total biomass, while plants comprise of almost 80%. Insignificant on the numbers, humans caused an irreversible damage and changing climate. Earth with natural extinction rate of 10% will not affect its ecosystem with the loss of 0.01% humankind. It is negligible. The planet will continue to thrive without man. In fact, termites and ants are much more important than man. Humanity direly needs to acknowledge its abuses and oppression done to other living organisms. For man to continue to exist, consequently needs nature. It is time to recognize that we are nature. We are interbeing participants in a dynamic whole, and we cannot be separated from it. Let us regenerate rather than exploit. Let us thrive together rather than compete against. Let us roam the earth and regenerate. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
All right. So, really, Architect Ronnie, Yuma, it's really good. It's really good that we are actually having those conversations regarding, topics about how human really affects the environment, and knowing that there's a lot of architects, still pursuing for a good environment, and that is correct. That for us to make sure that um, the thing is, environment can survive without humans, but humans cannot survive with environment. So let's go ahead and save our environment. Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed to our next speaker. That's again, it's architect Micaela Rosette Santos Tayag, Philippine Green Building Initiative. So Micaela Rosette Santos Tayag is part of the membership committee of the Philippine Green Building Initiative, and also LEED accredited professional for building design and construction. She's also an architectural heritage conservation advocate and a lecturer of the Department of Architecture of Holy Angel University in Angeles City and the University of the Philippines Diliman College of Architecture and Viatlas Career Development Center. Let's give our ears to Architect Micaela Rosette Santos Tayag.
So again, I'd like to say I would also like to thank UAPGA Quezon City for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with Architect Louis Gan and Architect Ronnie Yumang. So tonight I will be talking about green building initiatives in the Philippines. So Architect Louis mentioned some strategies on how to make buildings green, and of course, Architect Ronnie shared with us some tips on how to use regenerative architecture, which is beyond green architecture. And for this time, I will be sharing the initiatives that we have in the Philippines for green buildings. Let me start with my connection with the Climate Reality Project. It was mentioned by Sir Francis earlier that the Climate Reality Project is an initiative of the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, to spread awareness on the climate crisis that we are actually in right now. In 2016, this training was brought in the Philippines, and there were about 600 participants in this training. And I was, of course, part of this. I was very, very lucky to be part of this training, and this was actually our official picture. Last July and August, there was again the first ever global and online training because, of course, of the pandemic. But back in 2016, it was actually a face-to-face seminar with over 700 participants, 500 of which were from the Philippines. So I was there. That's me. That's actually me. So in this training, Al Gore highlighted and asked which country experiences the most weather-related disasters. And the answer to this, of course, which actually surprised me, and of course, naisip ko parang ang dami naman pwede mag-top ng Pilipinas. Dito pa tayo nag-top sa, pwede naman tayo sana mag-top sa pinakamagagandang babae, pinakasarap na pagkain. Dito pa sa pinakamaraming number of weather-related major events. And can you imagine, in not even 10 years, we've experienced 300 of these, over 300 of this. This is, of course, because we are located along the Pacific Ring of Fire, where 75% of the world's active and dormant volcanoes are located and 90% of the world's earthquakes are felt. Of course, both of these phenomena we've experienced in our lifetime. So what is the scenario that we are in right now? Because of rapid urbanization, there is a need for a lot of buildings. And also, these buildings would require energy, and we have, they say, the highest cost of energy in Asia, with one of the highest of the developing countries. And of course, like I mentioned, we are in the midst of a climate crisis, and right now, kaya nga tayo nandito ngayon dahil pandemic. That is why it's very important that we as architects think green and design green. So what are green buildings? Architect Louis discussed what green buildings are, but let me just give a definition. Ang green buildings now, these are high-performance buildings that are less taxing to the environment. They're concerned for the natural resources, better in environmental and energy performance, and they are after the welfare, the productivity, the comfort, and the health of the occupants. They use a rating system as reference for design and construction. So these are structures that use a process that is environmentally responsible and resource efficient throughout the whole life cycle of the building, which includes itong buong life cycle niya starts at the identification of the site, yung design process, construction, operations and maintenance, renovation, and finally, if it when it reaches the end of its life, which is demolition. So like I mentioned, these green buildings, they use a system as a rating system as a reference.
So hello guys, because of the technical difficulty, there's some error in our system right now, so we need to wait for this, okay? So yeah, about architect reset, gusto ko yung sinabi niya na we need to think green and design green so that mag-iisip tayo kung ano yung pwede natin solution for the environment so we can design and decide on what we're going to design or what we're going to build in the future. Okay, our next speaker is Reginald Rex Barrer, the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, an environmental scientist and licensed environmental planner. He has more than 20 years of progressive experience in climate and environment, work locally and abroad. He is climate reality leader and holds master's degree in environmental science and management from the Yale School of the Environment. Again, please welcome Reginald Rex Barrer. Hello, sir.
Thank you. Congratulations on having this event, and I'd like to take this opportunity to build on the presentations by the previous resource persons. So if I may start for the next slide, please. What we're going to talk about will be green and gray infrastructure. So this information, for example, that you see on the screen right now is one of the most common, if not the most common visual benchmark of climate change. More commonly, that would be advisories from PAGASA. Binanggit ito kanina ni Francis. And normally what we associate with climatic events particularly would be typhoons for the Philippines. Of course, there are still a lot of other events or climatic events. These are extreme weather events that we refer to. But of course, there are still other events like storm surges or sea level rise. As you've seen, if we do not make any changes with our practices, we're looking at a 2-degree future, for example, and that there would be even a worse impact for more people, for example, if we are projecting a 4-degree future. As I've mentioned, climate change and the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense has referred to it as a threat multiplier. And we see this not only in terms of typhoons, but that there are other events that we will associate with this. In a research recently that was published by CNN, in fact, they shared that beyond sea level rise, for example, you've probably heard of storm surges. And these are only two of the issues that we'll probably be facing in the Philippines. As I mentioned, climate change is a threat multiplier. That means it actually exacerbates or makes events that we experience, disasters, as mentioned by Francis earlier, climate change actually makes it worse. We've had typhoons before. Architect Yumang actually referred to our history, for example, of typhoons, even way back, probably beyond the time when serious or strict documentation of these events were even a conscious effort. Meron na tayong mga bagyo. as a young child, for example, I've known or I've usually experienced or seen typhoons that that will probably have covered the entire alphabet. The Filipino alphabet, for example, meron at meron tayong pangalan mula simula hanggang dulo. And that has been there for the longest time. What has not been seen before is the level of intensity that we've encountered for typhoons. And with the intensity or the increasing intensity of typhoons, we have, for example, as the years have gone by, we've seen that storm surges, for example, have gone beyond what we've normally experienced. No? Habang tumatagal, nakikita natin na mas malayo na kuminsan yung naaabot ng mga storm surges. Idagdag mo dyan yung issue, for example, of the question of, say, land subsidence. And then if you have natural tidal changes, if it so happens that a typhoon occurs when the tide is high, when land subsidence occurs, storm surges normally would become worse. So you have all these things, it will be a perfect storm, for example. But beyond what was also shared, next slide, please. From a climate lens, how do we look at addressing these issues more broadly? Siguro among the members, once or twice you've encountered these terms. No? When we refer to ecosystem-based adaptation, we're actually looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services, no? As part of an overall adaptation scheme. Nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions actually refer generally to similar climate solutions. No? Natural climate solutions actually emphasize more the aspect of mitigation. These are activities that actually increase the level of mitigation from nature and may include parts of adaptation. It's part of benefits. No? When we speak of climate change, normally we associate it with what is referred to as co-benefits. No? Mitigation and adaptation working together to reduce, for example, the emissions. At the same time, if we are unable to minimize the impact, then we have to adapt. Kailangan nating gawan ng paraan. No? The expression normally we associate with this is kung maikli ang kumot, mamaluktot. No? And probably that would be appropriate in terms of referring to adaptation from a Filipino perspective. Examples of this, in the next slide, you'll see some of the solutions that have been identified. You have here, for example, reforestation. You'd probably not associate it to, let's say, design of a single structure of infrastructure generally. But this looks at the environment where you intend to, say, set up, install, or construct any edifice or building. These are largely what we consider as methods that would help us reduce emissions, for example, as well as allow us to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Avoided deforestation or degradation or restoration of degraded land simply means that we try to minimize, for example, the need to extract resources from the forest. Normally, this would be in the form of cutting down trees and the consequences that come with them. Restoration of mangroves and coastal ecosystems is another example that we normally have already associated with how we can reduce the impact that we have on the environment. Mangroves, for example, for the Philippines, the consideration there would be the fact that we have one of the longest coastlines, being an archipelagic country. We have that advantage, for example, of having a large amount of space for which we can replant appropriate species of mangroves. Peatlands, not in the same extent as, say, Indonesia or Malaysia. No? But the problem, for example, that Malaysia and Indonesia have encountered is the fact that even their peatlands have been deforested. to give way, for example, to what you refer to as planting of palm oil because of global demand for it. Cropland nutrient management refers to largely maintaining the amount of nitrogen that helps, or that is commonly an ingredient in fertilizers to increase productivity of the land. But the problem with that is increase in nitrogen on land. If it leaches, for example, in rivers, you eventually have nitrogen in the amounts that we put on land going to open water, oceans, seas, for example, and eventually create algal bloom. So, going to illustrative examples of all these natural climate solutions. Next slide, please. This is probably something that you've already seen. And when we refer to green-gray infrastructure, it is not necessarily a departure from what we refer to as natural climate solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation. But what you do now have before you would be a combination of, say, conservation and restoration of ecosystems with the gray approaches or engineering approaches, no, that you would normally associate with, say, solutions that have been adapted in order to minimize the impacts or to adapt to the impacts from climate change. No? So ito yung kadalasan nakikita natin na seawall, etc. No? Pero sa examples na papakita ko sa inyo as an elaboration of all those we've enumerated earlier, ito yun, no? Halimbawa, normally when you have bodies of water, particularly in, say, urban areas, because of the amount of concrete, as an architect, Humang also referred to the amount of concrete that we use in terms of the development that we normally associate with that urbanization, for example, it has to be a concrete jungle. No? But this freshwater green-gray infrastructure solution actually allows what you refer to as hydrologic function. No? Yung hydrologic function can come in, for example, when you create or restore a floodplain and that you have potential seasonally flooded farmlands that because of a terrace or a levee that you create allows the water to go down bodies of water, no? Streams or rivers. No? Next slide, please. You also have, and the two ensuing slides would be largely on coastal green-gray infrastructure. And with green-gray infrastructure for coastal areas, of course, this is where concerned mangroves come in. As we all know, mangroves have already been identified as an adaptation measure. No? What does it do? You have storm surges. Mangroves generally are able to buttress the impact of storm surges. No? Areas, for example, where there are communities already benefit from mangroves protecting them. And then, of course, you have breakwaters to also allow the reduction and of wave energy. No? There's also rainwater harvesting earlier seen, and in summary, it's simply referred to as climate change science. No? Climate adaptation and mitigation will always be things that you now have to consider in how you plan and develop your design. No? Change, it will always be there. No? So what may have been applicable currently will always have to be under review, assessed, determine whether this will work in the future, as well as lastly, science is something both now natural and social sciences. Social sciences in the context of how people relate to one another. During the pandemic, one of the critical inadequacies, for example, of cities in urban areas would be the absence of parks, for example, so the absence of bike lanes. No? Natural science also, again, in the manner by which you're able to predict how much impact, no, the categories of typhoons, for example, are able to help us decide what kind of structures should be put in place in particular areas. And we've seen, for example, that if we don't follow what nature presents to us as limitations of how we develop these things, we end up being affected in the long run. No? So that basically summarizes the presentation. Marky, thank you very much. Shane, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sir Rex, with the information that you have given regarding climate changes, all those relevance of how we could improve our cities regards of doing urban planning. I want to acknowledge our our other host, Mr. Jonathan Cruz. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Good evening to all our speakers. So, thank you so much for joining us today. So, for now, we'll be heading towards the next part of our event, which is the panel discussion. So, I will review to you the guidelines for the panel discussion. So, the panel discussion will have one moderator, which is me, and the discussion will start after the presentation of all the guest panelists, which we just had. And then 5 to 8 pre-selected questions or subtopics will be asked to the panel. So let's all welcome back our panelists. Hello, everyone. Hi, we're all in. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Cruz, and I'm the Vice President of UAPGA Quezon City, and I will be moderating our panel discussion this evening. So first question that we have here is, it's actually a statement. So we're expecting this conversation to be as spontaneous as possible. So, okay, first, here's a statement, and we would like to know your opinion about this. The highest goal of green architecture is to be fully sustainable. Is there really a thing as full sustainability in terms of the built environment?
So, if we going, kung alamin natin ano, yung history ng green architecture, kailan pa siya na-develop? It was actually started during the 1960s, according to my reference, kung di ako nagkakamali. And slowly, nag-build up siya ng 1970s. Ngayon, fully blown na yung green architecture. Okay? Now, the purpose of green architecture is because there are designers in the past realized that the globalization that has happened, especially with the introduction of postmodern architecture, industrial revolution, the invention of cars. So during that time, no, they did not realize the environmental impact ng transportation and the globalization we had. And then slowly, na-realize na problema in terms of design dahil meron adverse environmental impact. Na-realize na natin dito na na-develop yung word green architecture, wherein you consider the environmental impact of the design to the environment. Anyway, the goal of the green architecture is actually to minimize as much as possible the effect of building environment. I think in my lecture earlier about carbon emission. Of course, buildings, they use energy, they consume power, and of course, they emit carbon emission. Okay? Ngayon, there are other components in sustainability that in green architecture. Hindi ko nabanggit kanina, green architecture kasi focuses on the building design. But if we assume that green architecture is the main focal point of sustainability, I think that is wrong. Kasi ang sustainability kasi encompasses everything. In fact, according to ano no, according to studies, uh, it's okay na mawala nga tayo mga tao. The planet will still survive. Pero yun na nga, of course, um, we need to make sure that our how we design our community can create and support other life. Ito yung hindi natin na-consider in architecture. Especially, yung tinatawag natin equality. For example, if you want to create a sustainable community, you will incorporate the rich and the poor living in the same environment. This is not the case in our country. Kung saan, socialized housing, they are located at the outskirts of Metro Manila, while middle income housing development, they are situated nearest the central business district. That alone is not very sustainable. And this is not addressed in architecture because this that mixing of different social classes in one community is more of urban planning. Okay? I think this is just one of the issues that if we really want to create a sustainable community, we need to look beyond the building. Okay, we also need to incorporate other life form in how we design our community. I think I mentioned earlier that we're going to design a built environment. We need to consider life form, the bees, the pollinating insect, the birds, and other life form. And I think this is not addressed in green art. Of course, magpo-provide tayo ng plants, landscaping, but those elements, they serve the human function. No, they really do not address the ecosystem, which really supported other life forms. Yun yung masasabi ko.
If we're only talking about green architecture, for example, and you associate it with sustainability, then you're not necessarily looking at green architecture within the context of, let's say, the bigger picture, which is, for example, architecture plays a role in society, for example, and the matter of sustainability applies more to that. So if you associate, for example, sustainability to development of a society, and Louis was able to elaborate on that very well, sustainability then might not be the only consideration for green architecture. I think there's a discussion already, or part of the list of questions, for example, that has to do with the definition of sustainability or sustainable development. And the Brundtland Commission actually already establishes the definition for that. And that has to do with being able to meet the needs of the current generation and allowing future generations to meet their own needs. Because if you set it in that context, then I don't think that you're only looking at sustainability for green architecture, but society in general. But that also emphasizes, or again, as architect Ronnie Yumang also mentioned earlier, you're putting man in the center of all these things, when what is important is that we see ourselves in association or in the context of other species. So if you're looking at, let's say, sustainable development, it should not only be current generation of people living now or having an anthropocentric perspective, but that we consider all the needs of other species as well.
Of course, what we want in green architecture is to save on energy, water, our site, our health, good indoor environmental quality, and the use of materials. And the goal is, of course, to preserve it not only for our generation, but for the future generations to come. So I would have to agree that it is one of the goals and possibly the highest goal of architecture, green architecture.
In addition to what the panelists are discussing earlier, I would like to point out. I would like to point out the very reason why we have these regenerative systems thinking. Okay, moving forward, sustainability sustainability, as we know, as defined by Mr. Rex Bader kanina, no, we are trying to save our resources. We are trying to be efficient on the usage of our resources. But what are we going to do in the year in 3 decades or so? No, by 2050, the world population will balloon to 9 billion. All right, and if we are only saving for the resources that we've been discussing earlier, for the sustainability, no, where are we going to use the rest of the material that we will need 3 decades from today? No, that means that there will be scarcity of resources already, and that's the reason why regenerative architecture systems thinking is here to be able to replenish what we are supposed to use by the year 3 decades or so. No, and that's the very purpose of regenerative system thinking. It's not only about anticipating, or it's not only about thinking about saving our resources for today. So green model and sustainable model is in co-collaboration with regenerative systems thinking. Both are important schools of thoughts, no, because it cannot outlive each of them, no. Dapat sabay sila, dapat pareho sila. Uh, while we are consuming, we need to replenish what we are consuming. No? Dapat papalitan natin yan. And we need to be conscious on the materials that we are using. As I have mentioned earlier, concrete and aggregates are limited resources. No? And that's the reason why we need to start right now as architects, as future architects. No? You need to understand what materials are we going to use in the future that will enable us to relieve, no, give a relief on these extracted resources, which is very, very important. And that's the reason why uh, correspondingly, dapat we need to also use the strategies of indigenous wisdom, ecological wisdom, and the frugal innovations, no? Because we cannot always live uh, on a bigger scale all the time. Especially this pandemic, no? It's a very big realization for all of us that hindi natin makakain yung magandang building natin, no, hindi tayo mabubuhay dun sa magandang building lang, no. And that alone is very significant for our architecture to contribute on the ecosystem's health, no, because when our architecture contributes to the ecosystem's health, that means stability of human existence as well. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, sir. Okay, so our next statement is also connected to what you were saying, that we should still look back to like the indigenous wisdom and traditional things that our ancestors have been doing for years. So here's another statement which we're asking your opinion about. So traditional design principles cannot fully meet the modern needs of architecture. Do you agree or do you disagree with that?
Earlier in my presentation, which you did not hear, I mentioned that there is perhaps one of the greenest structures there is actually the Bahay Kubo, the lowly Bahay Kubo. And I'm not, of course, it has all the elements. It is sensitive to the site. It uses very little energy and water. It uses materials that are in locality, environment
Let's
friendly.
put this.
And it has good indoor environmental quality. So it has all the elements of green architecture. But we definitely cannot build that in our context, because of course we have already indoor plumbing, we already have indoor electricity, so hindi na siya applicable in our setting. But there is definitely a lot we can learn from vernacular wisdom. Ang dami natin pwedeng matutunan na maa-apply natin in modern architecture. And some of the, well, a lot of architects are already doing that, have done that already. The likes of architect Bobby Manyosa has done that. Talagang in-incorporate niya itong mga elements of the Bahay Kubo in a modern structure. So, maybe hindi fully mamimit, pero pwedeng-pwede. And there is a lot that we can learn from that.
Now, traditional architecture and modern architecture, medyo ano to no? If you try to compare the two, medyo magkaiba sila with regards to principle. Now, if we analyze the nature's process, okay, in nature, all organisms, they evolve. Humans, nag-evolve pa rin tayo. Of course, we cannot see it in one day. It happens for generations. Now, you cannot see the changes. Pero definitely, nagbabago tayo. Pero one of the difference na makikita mo, for example, human biology. If you go to Asia, makikita mo may similarity in our character. Brown color, black eye, dark eyes. Now, if you go to Africa, no, they have different color. Their color, their skin is black. In other countries, in Western countries, their color is white. It has something to do with environmental context. That dictates what their biology should look like. Although we have the same DNA, pero very minuscule differences will make changes. Of course, this is biology. But what I'm trying to say is that in comparison to architecture, there should be an evolution that should happen from traditional to modern. Ang issue lang kasi na nakikita ko is because nowadays we design a building, we consider it as innovation, but it is not connected with our traditional roots. Now, if we really want to make an innovation, there should be a transition from traditional going towards modern. Okay? Not literally na kailangan kung ano yung itsura ng building noon, ganun pa rin yung itsura ng building ngayon. Definitely, iba yung climate noon, iba rin yung climate ngayon. Ito yung binabanggit ko na kailangan, meron tayong evolution. But the evolution should be guided by a process. Hindi yung we start with what we know, like we know right now, the technology that we have and use it in order to design new architecture form. Okay. Now, if we really want to move forward, I think we have to connect our design principle from traditional architecture, and then we use that. We integrate the strategies that are workable today, and then of course, nagbabago yung climate, we need to change. Okay, and therefore, kung ano man yung changes na dapat nating i-integrate because of what's happening right now, we have pandemic, we have climate change, global warming, we use that as our baseline for innovation, for evolution. And I think if we have this principle where we connect the past to the present, definitely we will have a more sustainable future. If nature is doing it, evolution-wise, dahan-dahan, hindi pwedeng okay, stop the evolution. Ito na agad yung itsura. Hindi ganun eh. Pero madalas tayo ganun yung idea natin when we do design. Okay, I will not respect tradition. I will design new form. So there's no evolution in that. So I think there should be an element of connectivity from the past to the present. If we do that, we have a direction in the future.
Yes, exactly. I think it's really important to know the history of the place because great architecture is always contextual. It's true to its history. Okay, from Sir Rex, can we hear from you?
Very briefly, I defer to colleagues on that question. Generally, I just referred to it towards the end of my presentation in relation to the fact that evolution representing change for that matter, is something that dictates how we essentially develop the kind of infrastructure that we want. No? But principles, in a sense, are supposed to be consistent throughout the time in terms of, let's say, for example, in relation to climate change, what is key there would be our adaptation to the environment. No? So it's not necessarily just creating a structure in a vacuum, but what the environment dictates. For example, how hot or how cold the environment is will also define or dictate what kind of structure that you develop or create. So your principles, of course, will define how you will proceed with that, including how you will evolve through time. We are finding out, for example, that a lot of changes as a consequence of climate change, and I'm aware that we will still have discussions on that later on, is already challenging the principles that we're using, is challenging the paradigms that we're actually using. So it might be worth assessing every so often what we're using. And even what is traditional and what is modern is also redefined depending on the circumstances again.
We are discussing the technology over indigenous or ecological wisdom. I would like to, I think you as future designers and architects, you know where the level of compromise should be, no? Or will be. I would like to present a scenario of a green and sustainable model right now. Look at BGC, which is considered, we have a lot of LEED certified buildings in BGC, Makati, or any prime metropolis of in the Philippines, no? But when you compare the kind of construction materials that was used there, the concrete in itself comprises 80% of the structure. How many, how much mountain or extraction did we do in order for us to create a green or sustainable building, right? So in comparison to this, are we really sustainable? Are we really doing it sustainably? No, either way, the technology that we are talking about is the same technology that brought us to the threshold of Anthropocene. No, these people, so-called experts and specialists, are the ones doing the extraction, right? They are the ones who knows how to extract these kinds of materials. They are the ones who knows how to convert it into construction materials, right? So if we are talking about technology that will harm the environment, that is bad, diba? If we are talking about developing technology for the rest of the living organisms, not only humans, then we will not be on this situation right now, right? If we will continue to develop the most sophisticated technology, which I believe is limited, no? As I gave the example earlier, all of the technologies that was focused on Yolanda, still we had more than 6,000 deaths, right? While in Batanes, we never even heard about it. Wala tayong nakitang technology na nakafocus doon. Wala ring anything that focuses there. Just pure indigenous and ecological wisdom. Mas maliit pa yung ginastos doon in terms of redevelopment or pagbigay ng mga donations sa kanila, no, ha? So what I'm trying to say here is that we know when to use the right technology. We all know. We all know. We don't need to. We don't need to really be confused, no? If it will ruin the environment, if it will ruin the other living organisms, we will be we will suffer too, because we are all interconnected. It's as simple as that. pag ginawa mong masama, pag tinapakan mo yung langgam, makakasama yan for humans. Akala natin, hindi, ano ha? But it will really affect us. Now, anong kinalaman nito sa architecture? Anong kinalaman nito sa pinag-uusapan natin or sa profession natin about architecture? This only shows that I laid down the foundation of the concept of regenerative systems thinking. How are we going to create an architecture that will respect other living organisms? No? For example, I will avoid or try to reduce consumption of my concrete usage on all of my design. Okay, that means a big relief on the extraction. What if all of us, the construction industry, which is the biggest stressor on the built environment, no? What if all of us have the same thinking? No? Instead of concrete, we will use timber. But then the government disallow us to use timber because it's bad for the environment. But yet they allow extraction, they allow quarrying, they allow mining. No, while if we will use timber, trees regenerates. No, in about 8 to 10 years, we will have materials to harvest. No? The only thing is that we are not planting trees, but it regenerates. No? So this is a very good comparison in with respect to extraction of materials. No? If as I mentioned earlier, actually this was I discussed this on my ebook, no, which is entitled "Connected." We cannot solve our situation right now if we will have the same thinking that we are using before. No? We need to rethink and redo the way we create our architecture. For example, our curriculum, our education. In fact, no, we have so many subjects like history of architecture, architectural design, but we don't have botany, we don't have biology, no, which is very much important in terms of creating life on architecture, right? So these are so-called compartmentalized education, where in fact um, the community of species have they are interconnected, but yet our architecture is compartmentalized, and so we do not understand, we do not have any idea of other relationship, no, to other profession. No? So that is the situation right now. That's the reason why we are focusing on being a specialist. We are focusing on being an expert, but we don't have the so-called generalist, no, who understands the interconnection of these communities. Yeah, back to you, Jonathan.
Okay, sir. So thank you so much on that. Okay, our next question is, with the emerging trends of the green architecture and the rise and the awareness of the effects of climate change, can we consider green design strategies only as suggestions, or are they really necessary to attain sustainable development?
Yeah, definitely. Green architecture is one of the strategies that we can do in order to mitigate climate change and global warming, and of course, to make our environment more sustainable. But there are other components, other disciplines that should take account to make our environment sustainable. Let's say we have sustainable logistics. Of course, this is different from green architecture. This is something to do with transportation, transfer of goods, etc. We also have sustainable food systems, wherein yung, by the way, one of the contributors of climate change is uh, how we source our food, no? Yung kinakain natin, it has a lot of uh, carbon, carbon emission, no? Yeah, in terms of its life cycle. So definitely, yeah, green architecture is one of the components which could lead us to a more sustainable environment. But then again, there are many uh, components in our um, environment that we need to address as well: sustainable tourism, sustainable transportation, so forth. So marami. So lahat ng mga ito kailangan integrated sa policy natin so that we can move ahead for more sustainable country.
If I may,
Sure, sure.
I generally agree with the statement, but let's go back to the last aspect of the question on whether green architecture should be a suggestion or a necessity.
Yeah.
That might have to be more refined as a question, because climate change does not necessarily allow you that much latitude. I guess there are, or there should be policy implications. For example, there are going to be requirements for changes that should allow you to adopt or mitigate more appropriately for climate change. So it's more likely a necessity, particularly in relation to sustainable development.
Yeah, I think it also points to like the policy making in our country, like do our laws really allow such practices?
Yes, yes, if I may. Of course, green architecture is necessary. There was a study conducted in 2006 in the US. Ang sabi nila, ang number one contributor greenhouse gas emissions daw ay ang buildings. Therefore, isa tayo sa mga nagko-cause ng climate change. Isa tayo sa mga nagko-contribute ng climate crisis. Kaya, importante that we reduce our energy consumption, our use of other resources, to be able to preserve our planet for the future generations. That's why it's very, very important. Going back to what Sir Ronnie is espousing, it's about regenerative architecture. This is, like I mentioned, beyond green architecture. Ang sabi niya, if I may borrow from his presentation before, sabi niya, ang green architecture daw is doing no harm. Kasi ang conventional construction and conventional buildings, it actually has a lot of negative impact in the environment. And ang green architecture is actually doing no harm. Wala kang ginagawang impact on the environment. And ang regenerative architecture goes beyond that. It's actually healing the planet. Diba? So, yun nga lang, wala ka pang ginagawang harm. It's hard enough. So, mas mahirap yung i-heal mo pa siya. Diba? That's why, before you can to healing, let's not harm you first. So, it's very, very important, lalo na ngayon, na gawin natin yan. Kasi isa yun sa makakatulong, like Sir Louis mentioned, it's just one component of hindi naman natin pwedeng akuin lahat, kasalanan lahat natin kung bakit nagkakaroon ng krisis sa mundo. But definitely, everything put together, makakatulong yan para maayos natin ang krisis na kinakaharap natin.
Yes, exactly. So we all agree naman na like sustainability is not just a job of one profession or one industry, but rather a holistic approach. Kasi if we're doing our part and others are not even contributing, it's kind of a bit harder. Okay, so next is, in a given project, how do you start the design process of like sustainable or green buildings? Do you start greening the internal space, or do you always have this intuition in you that when you design, it's automatically like green?
My design process usually, first, I need to be on site. I need to stand on the site and feel the environment, the scent, using the 5 senses. Okay. Sometimes I bring my drone and then fly around to see the totality of the environment. Okay. But most of the time also, I study the local context in terms of their tradition, the biology, the natural environment, because I need to be inspired. I need to look for an element that I can integrate in my design. Not hindi yung meron na akong style ko, ito na yung gagawin ko sa design because I want to be remembered by the people that this is my architecture design. I do not want my architecture to look like that. I want my architecture that when they see my building, they see the story of the place. I don't care if they don't recognize the designer, but I want my design to recognize the story, the tradition, the spirit of the place. I can do that by uh, first understanding the context of the site. Okay, and sometimes since I'm also a biomimicry practitioner, I study local organisms of the site, and then I understand what is the adaptation of that organism I can use in my design. Of course, it depends kung ano yung site. For example, meron kaming project ngayon in Mindoro, is a biodiversity conservation center. Literally, nasa bundok siya. So I look for an organism that survived the harsh environment of Mindoro. Okay? Of course, marami kaming na research, meron kaming partners, mga biologists, they give me these references, and then I use that to create an architecture that can adapt to its environment. Okay? Hindi ko lang masabi ngayon kung ano-ano yun kasi medyo marami. But definitely, we have a partnership with different biologists, and then we integrate those strategies into an architectural design. Of course, when we integrate this biological strategies in architecture, hindi naman to literally, for example, meron kami nakitang butterfly na maganda, literally gagayahin namin yung form ng butterfly. No, it doesn't, hindi ganun. It's more of the functionality. We try to copy, literally, yes, copy the functionality of that biology in our design. So usually, yun yung design process na ginagawa ko sa mga projects. Of course, there are, along the way, there are pa-iba yun, depending on context, but definitely that's the general step that I do. Trying to understand the story of the place.
If I may answer,
Sure.
I totally agree with what Architect Louis said about starting from getting to know the site, the environment, when you start your design process. Ito yung unang-unang kailangan mong i-consider because after all, the actually starts dun sa selection ng site. You have to get to know your environment before you can do anything else. Kailangan alam mo yung context in which your building would exist. So kailangan, it's very, I totally agree with everything that he said about yun nga. Also, hindi lang yung mga halaman na nandyan, pati mga insekto, kilalanin natin. And I think for students, dun sila medyo nagkakaroon ng mga pagkalito as far as yung what Architect Louis is studying right now, which is biomimicry. Akala nila ay, ang aking concept ay butterfly, therefore, ang aking building mukhang butterfly. It's beyond that. Diba? Parang more than that, you study the attributes and how did these exist? Paano sila thrive in an environment like that? So the first thing you need to do, get to know your site.
I would like to discuss the scenario that we did in one of our projects in Bantayan, Cebu. What we did is I studied the species right there, and then what are the migratory birds? What are the migratory species? And then from there, we created or also the culture, the history of the place as well, and the subsurface of that place now, because that place is a karst, no? Karst means mabato sila, no? Mabato. For all we know, kaya pala akala natin tamad yung mga taong magtanim doon, wala silang makain. Yun pala, hindi talaga tutubo yung mga tanim kasi bato nga yung surface, no? Because lime yung kanilang area. So with that, understanding these things, you don't just
Naririnig mo ba sila?
bring commercial sabihin mo doon yung
Kasi ang nakikita ko, umiikot-ikot lang na black
designing with
sa kanilang
nature.
tatlo. Ikaw lang ang nakikita ko.
The thing here is that it's not because meron kang plan, you are already designing with nature. No? Hindi porket in-accommodate mo yung magandang ibon, you are already designing with nature. You also have to accommodate the ugliest species, no? Yung pinakapangit, the worms, um, uh, uh, all the planktons, no, dun sa dagat, no. Lahat yan you have to accommodate. You have to be aware that when you paint these structures, yung chemical niyan pumupunta sa dagat, and therefore naapektuhan also yung soil. So did you know that lichens is a part nung moss, no? Yung moss are part na nagki-create ng kulay nung bato na ginagamit natin doon sa ating cladding, no? So these are vital elements doon sa pag-create nitong mga works na ginagamit natin. But if you put mga chemicals on the surface of architecture, pag na-wash off yan ng ulan, saan pumupunta yan? Doon sa soil. Pag napunta siya doon sa soil, pinapatay niya yung mga microorganisms sa soil, no? So therefore, you have to be very careful on creating or creating your specifications. No? So moving forward, I create my architecture by understanding what are my staple materials. No? I revolve with renewable materials like rammed earth, earth blocks, timber, things like that. No? And then from there, doon ako mag-create ng aking shape. And of course, what's on my mind is not the shape itself, but yung regenerativity along the circularity of the business model. While designing it, dapat alam mo na meron siyang obsolescence or meron siyang time, yung maximum life cycle niya. Ano ngayon ang gagawin mo dun sa structure pag luma na siya? Gigibain, panambak na lang siya, di ba? So hindi po pwedeng ganon. We need to understand that to be able to create value for the property again, you have to redo it. You have to redo it in a way na magki-create ka ng value doon sa iyong property. So what I'm trying to offer is both on the comprehensive aspect ng development, no? Hindi lamang siya on the architecture, it's a systems thinking. And that's the reason why very important na naiintindihan mo yung hangin, kung paano mo i-diffuse yung extreme wind. Trees can do that. Trees can diffuse these extreme wind by properly placing them, and then that reduces the impact dun sa structure mo, no? So things like this, it will really go a long way in aligning yourself with the rhythms and the patterns of nature. Thank you, Jonathan.
Next question is, as they say that everything has a limit, does the approaches of green architecture or green design also has a limit in its application, whether it be in terms of conservation, efficiency, and mitigation? So what are the challenges?
Sure, I'll go first. And
Sure.
again, this time I refer to the response of architect Humang in relation to obsolescence. So that addresses this question precisely. There is, for example, a philosophy now regarding instead of a cradle to the grave paradigm, there's a school of thought now in relation to a cradle to cradle perspective in the development of, say, the design of an object. So if you can expand on that, for example, in terms of green architecture, then that might be a good way to go. You're using a paradigm elsewhere that you can use in green architecture. Indeed, there are limits, but I guess that is also a question of how do we challenge ourselves to lengthen the life of anything, the structures that we build, the designs that we actually use. Probably that should be a consideration there. Architect Humang also mentioned, for example, the extent by which we use concrete. And we do have alternatives to concrete, for example. There are other materials that we can use, if only to also address the question of, let's say, a threat to the amount of sand, for example, that we use. So even before we reach that stage, again, you go back to the point of sustainability. Even before we reach that point, it may be good to actually already identify very good alternatives already. So to the materials that we use, to the designs that we have, to the principles that we follow, the policies, for example, that often more often than not would be the last aspect of designs, for example, that become up to date. So that there has to be a progressive aspect to how we move forward in that area. And architects generally can, as a profession, can actually serve as an influence on how laws and policies should be pursued.
To answer that question, Jonathan, um, let's say, for example, that we are building a house, no, for example, and this house, we are not thinking of what will happen at the end of its life cycle. 50 years, 100 years, for example. We don't really bother about it. But if nagpalit ng may-ari along the way, namatay yung tunay na may-ari, no, pinamana niya sa mga anak, and I don't want this structure anymore, I'm going to destroy it, gigibain ko na yan, and then yung semento na ginawa natin, panambak na lang, right? So, if we will think of a much valuable life cycle or value chain along this model, what if we create prefab models, all screwable, all model, customized models? Yung model na yan, ang gagawin natin is like, pwede mo siyang palitan, ang papalitan mo lang is the screw, kasi nabulok na siya. And then the wood can be used into something else. No? Now, of course, this will incur cost, right? But we need to balance, we need to outweigh. If you're going to change it, if you're going to regenerate the structure, it will give you a new value for your property, right? Rather than ang isang property nagde-depreciate every year, right? So, in real estate principle, yung obsolescence, no, ang tendency niyan is when the more you reach that age, bumababa yung kanyang value. So what I'm trying to do is, bago dumating doon sa age na yon, just like what the Japanese are doing, no? The Japanese are doing, every after 50 years or 25 years, they will rebuild yung kanilang structure, yung kanilang traditional structure. That is number one, because of the transfer of technology, transfer of information, for example, yung craft nila. No? In fact, we have vanishing trades, no? Solihiya, yung wood joineries, etc. These are the ones, kaya wala tayong craftsmen eh, di ba? Our craftsmen, our workers are there just to earn every day. Pero they are not really crafts people, right? And so this is what I am advocating. We want to spread livelihood to people who knows these things. In fact, I'm going to develop a seminar for Solihiya. I'm going to use that as my facade. I'm going to use that as my skin for architecture. And that skin collaborate with the habitat, no? With the habitat of the fireflies, no? So I'm creating parametricism not because of the shape. That's not just for the pure joy of human eye, but because I want to increase the habitat of the living organisms. So that's the very purpose. So I am coexisting. I co-thrive with other living organisms. Dapat maging healthy sila. And did you know that if you exceed yung lighting at night, nawawala yung mga living organisms diyan. Ang ganda-ganda tingnan para sa tao, right? Pero the animals, the living organisms, they move away from humans because for them, we are a threat. We are predators, right? Pero when I tried turning off the lights, all of the fireflies are around us. No? So these are the kind of thinking that architects are, I think, mali yung pananaw natin doon. No? Akala natin kung ano maganda sa atin, maganda sa environment. Wrong. That is because what is order for us is chaos to nature. What is order for nature is chaos for humans. No? So we have to be very careful. If you want to design with nature, you don't just copy them. You live with nature. You live.
I mentioned earlier that the greenest structure is probably the bahay kubo. And right now, hindi na nga pwede. Aside, of course, from, yun nga, iba na yung setting and everything, kahit na gusto mo siguro, you are limited with the resources available. Wala na tayong mga materials. So perhaps, right now, what we can do is come up with our own, with what is available. So it's very challenging because it entails a lot of research and development, but it is possible. So yun nga, we can just use whatever it is that we have and learn how to design yung pinakamaganda with the limitations that we have.
Yes, so I think investing more on research, especially in our profession, in the built environment, is really important because like nowadays, not a lot of people do research.
Yes. On green architecture, of course, yeah, there are limits and boundaries in green architecture. If nature has limitations, definitely, everything has its own limits and boundaries. And I think one of the limits of green architecture is that it is contextual based. Okay. What is green in here in the Philippines? For example, you have this set of strategies to combat heat island or stormwater, or perhaps how to make water efficient structure or buildings. Some of these strategies cannot be adopted in other areas because if the building is located in a in an area na maraming supply ng tubig, so why are you going to incorporate water efficient design strategies kasi hindi na siya efficient, no? So it's more of contextual based. I think the limitation is that green architecture should be adapted to local context, and of course, I think the limits is that we have to understand Earth's operating conditions so that we know the bounds and limits of what our the design thinking, of sustainability. Maraming sila in nature, of course, sunlight, water, gravity. These are some of the resources that you can get in nature that you can incorporate in your building. Okay. These are our limitations. So how are we going to leverage those limits? And in nature, it's always cyclic. Minsan kung ano yung na-produce ng waste directly on the spot can be a source of raw material for other species, for example. So perhaps we can metaphorically follow the same. Kung meron tayong waste on our building, on the spot, we recycle them. Hindi na natin siya itatapon, hindi na natin siya itatransfer pa sa ibang lugar. So create that cyclic processes. If nature is doing it, so why can't we? So I think it's more of the contextual. Green architecture is more of context-based.
Yes, definitely. So also like as a young I mean I'm not yet an architect, but like as a young person like me, I think what's really um bad about now is that we're so blinded by the illusion of like Western architecture, even if wala naman sa context, we keep on like copying them, and we even try to make them contextual, even if in the first place they're not really contextual at all because they're in a different era. Last question for this discussion is if you will be able to give your own definition of sustainability, at least in architecture or in the built environment, what would it be?
The best definition has been established back in '87, but that's not necessarily just sustainability, but sustainable development. No? So, in our common future, that was the work of the Brundtland Commission. They referred to sustainable development as the ability of the current generation to meet its needs, while also allowing future generations to meet their own needs. So if you apply it probably to green architecture, you will look at it in the context of how you create or develop the designs with the resources that you have, but not necessarily compromising future generations to uh, come up with their own designs, follow the principles that might be appropriate at a future time. In that context, you allow opportunities for the evolution of how green architecture itself evolves. We know even as we probably define green architecture the way our sphere of experiences define it, it might vary at a future time, depending on how we address the problems that we are facing now. If we are able to do that, I think that that would be in that context of sustainability.
If I would define green architecture or sustainability, I think sustainability should be is a process of creating conditions conducive to life. So when I discuss or mention life, not only for humans at the present, we may consider the past, no, the tradition we use, we connect the present situation right now, and definitely it will have an impact in our future. And when we also talk about life, not only human species, we need to consider other organisms because naniniwala ako, if we really want to make sustainable environment, I think the dragonfly, the bees, and other insects, I'm not saying about pests, they're different. Definitely, they have function kung bakit nagkakaroon ng pest dahil meron tayong pest. But definitely, these species play a significant positive environmental impact to our ecological services. So I think if we create or design architecture, buildings, siguro we can think of other organisms. Paano ba sila, paano benefit ng architecture design ko on other species? Kasi personally, ako, when I go to Slovenia, nagulat ako, yung bubong, laging merong bird's nest. So that means, if their architecture is supporting other life form, I think we can also follow the same. So that's my interpretation of sustainability. Kasi ako, I live in Manila. Hanggang ngayon, for this year, wala pa ako nakikitang bees or dragonfly. Compared nung 90s, nung bata-bata pa tayo, ang dami ko nakikita, hinuhuli pa namin. No? Yung beetle, talagang ginaganon namin. No? It's something na hindi ko na nakikita sa mga kabataan ngayon. This is what we are missing right now. Ako, totally, personally, namimiss ko yung ganong setup. At least makita ko man lang may lumilipad na bubuyog or dragonfly sa environment ko dito sa Manila. Pero wala akong nakikita. That means, yun pa lang, probably it's one indication that I am not living a sustainable environment because I only see humans thriving. So sustainability for me should create conditions that are conducive to life.
I think I will not delve on the definition of sustainability because we already have a very good definition of it. No? I would rather focus on how are we going to implement or execute sustainability, to be able to do what is necessary. I think that is the problem. That lies the problem. In fact, a lot of it is being used for marketing purposes, no? In fact, makikita mo merong mga malalaking mall pero they will claim themselves as sustainable, no? But it's not really makikita mo hindi siya practical, hindi siya logical, hindi siya reasonable, no? So for me, it's about living it, no? It's about doing it, no? Implementing it. No? Yun yung kailangan natin gawin for me.
My personal understanding of sustainability is, although I am not much of a Bible reader, I am pretty sure it's written somewhere in the Bible that when God created man, He meant for man to live in abundance. Hindi naman niya ginawa yung tao, sinabi niya, maghirap ka. So He gave us the sun, He gave us the earth, He gave us the birds, the bees. Binigay niya lahat yan para mag-thrive tayo. But what we often forget is God is not yet done with creation. Hindi pa niya tapos ginawa. Tapos niya natapos gawin yung mga anak natin, yung mga magiging apo natin. And if we have the right to live in abundance, our children, our children's children, they have that same right. That's why we have to, wag naman tayong masyado swapang. Wag nating isipin na tayo lang yung anak ng Diyos dahil hindi pa siya tapos. He's not yet done in creation. Ang sabi nga ni Gandhi, there is enough for man's need, but not enough for man's need.
Yeah, that's a very nice definition. So, I think this ends our discussion, and since we're running out of time, we couldn't entertain any more questions from our audience. So, on behalf of UAPGA Quezon City, I, Jonathan Cruz, would like to personally thank our panelists, Sir Rex, Sir Louis, Sir
Thank
Ronnie,
you.
and Architect Rosette for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts with us. So,